we're joined by two former Trump White House insiders who know Cassidy Hutchinson very well. Former White House Director of Strategic Communications, Alyssa Farah Griffin, and a former top aide to Vice President Mike Pence, Olivia Troy. You and Cassidy Hutchinson are close, so you have actually spoken to her. I knew nothing about her. I'd never seen her speak other than in the deposition. She was remarkably composed and credible, and I think her testimony will be very impactful. How is she doing?
She's doing great. She's in good spirits. I think the magnitude of the moment has certainly begun to dawn on her and how significant of a role she's playing in American history. She's somebody who I would have trusted in any scenario to keep their word, to get a job done, but she's always been a behind-the-scenes player. So to see her front and center with millions and millions of people watching and to maintain such poise and confidence doing what dozens of people twice her age, 3 times her age, are too terrified to do, refusing subpoenas, not showing up, was remarkable. It was inspiring, honestly, as a woman to watch. I don't even know what the biggest takeaway from today was. I had a sense of what she was going to say. This went far beyond anything I knew of. From the fact that she confirmed the former president wanted to see more violence on January 6th. He knew there were weapons and he wanted to see them used. To wanting to take over the beast, his car, and potentially drive it to Capitol Hill. I mean, she painted a picture of what was even worse than what I knew when I resigned in December, early December of 2020, which was a man unhinged, out of touch with reality, and with advisors around him seemingly doing nothing to stop it.
You were in the room, Olivia Troy, and I want to play one of the most shocking moments from the testimony today, in which Cassidy Hutchinson is describing. She's at the little staging area at the January 6th rally, the quote-unquote Stop the Steal rally, with Donald Trump. He's frustrated because there isn't as big a crowd as possible, and he's blaming that on the magnetometers. So we're going to play that, and then I want to hear what the response was like for you and others that you were sitting among in the committee hearing when that happened.
And he felt the mags were at fault for not letting everybody in, but another leading reason, and likely the primary reason, is because he wanted it full, and he was angry that we weren't letting people through the mags with weapons, what the Secret Service deems as weapons and our weapons. But when we were in the offstage announce tent, I was part of a conversation. I was in the vicinity of a conversation where I overheard the president say something to the effect of, I don't effing care that they have weapons. They're not here to hurt me. Take the effing mags away.
They're not here to hurt me. What was your response to that? And what was she goes on to say, by the way, that we're going to go up to the Capitol also. What was your response? What was the response of the members of Congress who were in the Capitol January 6th, the officers who were wounded on January 6th?
Yeah, it was infuriating. I felt sick to my stomach, and as I was sitting there, I had a member of Congress to the right of me, Congressman Gallegos, and to the left of me, I had Sergeant Gonell, who suffered significant injuries that day. And there was Mike Vanone, Harry Dunn, Hodges. They were all sitting there, and I looked to them to see their faces, and then we looked at each other, and I could hear the audible gasp in anger hearing that clip, because when you think about it, this sets a picture of the president leading the charge there and setting them up. And that was something that was said right there as I was sitting there. Yeah. They said they set us up. And I can't imagine seeing that clip and living that day the way they did, and seeing the president of the United States talk about a crowd that wasn't big enough and that had weapons and saying, let them in.
So I've seen in social media and in news media, that there are people out there, including conservative lawyers, who say that this is the smoking gun. Mm-hmm. This is Donald Trump knowing that people were armed and not considering them a threat to him and wanting to send those armed people to Capitol Hill. Mm-hmm. How did you interpret it?
I agree with that. I think the Pat Cipollone quote, which I don't want to botch, but essentially saying why he shouldn't drive up to Capitol Hill because you would have committed a number of felonies in doing so, or crimes in doing so, was very significant. And I think that also speaks to why, frankly, Pat Cipollone's not come and testified before the committee. But I expected this hearing to really go after Mark Meadows, and it certainly did that. It certainly put him in hot water. But this tied it directly to the former president, talking about the knowledge he had of the danger he was putting people in at the Capitol, and his own vice president, who he knew was there. He was fine with people with weapons going to Capitol Hill.
So just the quote that you were referring to is Cassidy Hutchinson testifies that she hears the White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, and once again to underline, loyal Donald Trump supporter. You have to be the White House counsel in December and January 2020, 2021. He says to Cassidy Hutchinson, don't let the presidential limo, don't take Donald Trump up to the Capitol. Do not let that happen. Quote, we're going to get charged with every crime imaginable if we let that happen.
They knew, and he still wanted to go forward. And then again, this incredible scene of him reaching over the wheel of the Beast. I've been in the Beast. This is a massive vehicle. He's a huge man. He's 6'3", 6'4", physically trying to take control of the car. This is a man detached from reality. And if today's testimony does not make some Republican members of Congress and Republican voters change their mind about this man, I don't know what will, because it was pure insanity.
And at the end of the hearing, Liz Cheney, the vice chair, again, a very conservative Republican.
They're all Republicans.
I know, and not just Republicans.
Loyal.
They're all very conservative Republicans who supported Donald Trump's election in 2016, election in 2020, et cetera, et cetera. But she reads some witness unnamed witness testimonies, basically sounding as though Trump world is reaching out to them and saying, "You better not say anything bad about us." Before the committee, whether behind closed doors or in front. And the suggestion was that it was witness tampering. Do you know anything about what's going on behind the scenes? Have you heard any stories like that? And either way, what's your reaction?
Yeah, I'm not surprised to hear that there's intimidation of the witnesses and bullying. I mean, this is how these people behave. And so I think that it's certainly something that the committee should be investigating and looking into. I think, again, I think they've made reference to that they are going to look into this. And I think, given Cassidy Hutchinson's bravery today, I think they owe it to people like her and others who told the truth, who went on record, while all of these other cowards stand by and allow this moment and continue to enable this danger that continues across our country and America.
What is it like for you guys? Because I can't ask Cassidy Hutchinson this question, but she's in the same group. What is it like for you guys to be former members of MAGA, which claims to be a bunch of alphas who think they're so manly and heroic and virile, to be young women who are showing more courage individually than almost every House male Republican, almost every Trump White House administration official, certainly more so than Cipollone, who sounds like he was trying to do the right thing but won't come forward and testify, Mark Meadows, et cetera. What is that like?
Well, I'm so in awe of both Cassidy Hutchinson, Sarah Matthews, people who have come forward. But I'll also say this, it's kind of surreal to watch as somebody who worked for Trump and believed in part of his agenda, and someone like Cassidy, who was a loyal foot soldier. No one would have wanted to be in this position less than Cassidy Hutchinson. This is the last place she wanted to be today, but she felt her duty to the country was way more important than her personal loyalties. And I'm so grateful for women like Olivia who've come forward, but I don't know where all the seated members of Congress are who aren't stepping up. I don't know where the former cabinet secretaries who've remained conveniently quiet since this are.
What's it like for you? I mean, because you came out in 2020 basically warning the world about this man and how, in your view, unhinged and dangerous he was.
Yeah, and I'm grateful for people like Cassidy who are out there telling the truth about what the reality was in the days and in the aftermath of the election. And it's frustrating and it's angering at times to watch these people continue to enable such a dangerous individual that has proven himself to be dangerous time and time again. And look, Cassidy, her life will be forever changed. Mm-hmm. My life will never be the same. Alyssa's life will never be the same because we stood up and we told the truth. We stood up for our country. And people will say, oh, there's nothing heroic about that. You worked in the Trump administration. Well, you're hearing about the intimidation of witnesses. You're hearing about the bullying. There's no doubt that there are going to be threats on Cassidy's life. I'm worried about her safety. Look, we've gotten threats recently. We were just talking about this and what it means to still continue to be out there talking about this and warning people.